Can you guys hear me? Thumbs up if yes. Great. Okay. Hazem, maybe we begin. May we begin?
Please.
Wonderful. Welcome everybody to what is the 16th online cultural Majlis. It gives me great pleasure to have our guest today, Hazem Jamjoum, who is an individual that I respect very much, personally and professionally, for the work he's doing. Hazem will be introduced tonight by Rana Dawood, who's a senior producer at Sawt, a podcast company based in Amman. She hosts Dumtak, an Arabic podcast documenting narratives of music and musicians in the region. The show launched in April 2019 and has released 2 seasons so far. Rana, before you introduce Hazem, where can we listen to Dumtak?
At any podcast, wherever you listen to your podcast. We're available on all platforms. You can head to our website, sowt.com, that's SOWT.com, /Dumtak, DOMTAK. And you'll find links to all possible podcast apps out there.
Thank you. Please proceed.
Thank you. Thank you for the intro. I'm humbled to have been invited by Sultan to present Hazem, especially for the relevance he presents to my work. So let me introduce Hazem. He's a curator of the British Library's early 20th century audio recordings of relevance to Arab and Gulf history. His work is fostered through the British Library Qatar Foundation Partnership Program. It aims at digitizing, cataloguing, and contextualizing this part of Arab communities' audio heritage. So over the past year, Hazem, together with Professor Milena Dobreva from UCL Qatar's Department of Library and Information Studies, they have led a project aimed at identifying similar at-risk audiovisual collections in the region, with the longer-term aim of fostering such preservations and curation at a wider scale. And as a part of the same project, he has presented on Arab audio heritage preservation at places like Kuwait University, Sultan Qaboos University, Oman's National Records and Archives Authority, and the Qatar National Library. He also appeared at events like 2019 UNESCO conference supporting documentary heritage preservation in the Arab region, as well as various forums in the UK. And Hazem's doctoral research in modern Middle East history at New York University traces the connections between the production of Arabic music as a concept and as a commodity, and the broader implications of these production processes on the emergence of Pan-Arabism. And to be honest, I was not familiar with Hazem's work, so I'm very excited and looking forward very much to this session. So the floor is yours, Hazem. Tfaddal.
Thanks, Rana. Thanks, Sultan. Eid Mubarak, everyone. And thanks for kind of taking time out of your evenings, your homebound evenings, to talk about audio preservation in the Arab region. My presentation today is going to be somewhat technical. I'm kind of going to give a history of audio recording and then talk about some of the risks. So I'm basically giving this history so that we have a sense of the formats that audio has been recorded on over the past century and a half. And then some of the risks that are attendant on the materials that these recordings are made on, the carriers as we call them. Sort of I'll take a little detour here and there to talk about sort of the kind of audio recording in the Arab region. But then in the Q&A, maybe we can sort of go into some more detail about some of these things, especially sort of the more Arab-specific ones. And we're really lucky that we have Mustafa Saeed here with us tonight. He knows far more than I ever will about most of these things. And I'll mention his Amar Foundation at the end of my talk. So I'm going to kind of share my presentation here. I guess I need to sort of maximize it somehow. All right. So how does that look? Yeah. Kind of briefly, you know, maybe most of us have heard that Thomas Edison invented the phonograph or sound recording. The what I want to kind of go through here is, you know, in the entirety of the 19th century, so from the time that Edison invents his invention until, you know, the very early 1900s, sound recording is not a lucrative business. It's very difficult to mass produce and distribute these things. So the very earliest things that we could call sound recordings is from 1857, this object called a phonautograph. And what a phonautograph does is it actually just records the sound wave itself. So it makes these sort of scratches that you couldn't play back. It wasn't until I think the 1950s or 1960s that somebody sort of took these and tried to figure out what it was that people tried to record, and found out that one of the first ever recordings was the song Au clair de la lune. It wasn't, so here's kind of just an overall timeline, but I'm going to go through these so we don't really, I'm sort of going to whiz through because I'm going to try to finish in about 20, 25 minutes. So, you know, if you have any questions, sort of make a note of them and we can come back to them. But it was around in the late 1870s that Thomas Edison figures out that he can sort of scratch these sound waves onto a piece of tinfoil. And this was effectively the first phonograph. And as maybe you can see here, it kind of etches it on, and then a player can take that and replay it. Obviously, it's going to be very, very terrible quality and extremely fragile. This is really kind of a thin piece of tinfoil that would rip very, very easily. And he couldn't figure out how to make money from it. So he very quickly kind of diverts his attention to things like alternating and direct current questions of electricity. It was Alexander Graham Bell and his team who decide to sort of take up the task and make something even better. And they figure that they could create a sturdier object, a sturdier recording using something like wax. And so this is where we get the wax cylinder, and the very early years of the phonograph industry and the recording industry are these things that are called wax cylinders, which is why in Arabic we still use the word for cylinder, al-istiwana or istiwanat, even for things that are aqras or discs or other kinds of sound recordings. And so that word istiwanat carries over from the very early 1900s into things that are no longer cylindrical. These are actually quite durable, and one of the interesting things about these early wax cylinders is that the way that the sound wave is etched onto them is kind of not laterally the way that we think of, but the stylus would move up and down along these ridges that look like hills and valleys. In the following decade, in the 1880s, Emil Berliner tries to sort of put his own stamp on this, and he does something very important, which is figure out that you can use a lateral moving stylus, so from right to left instead of up and down, on an object that looks like the disc, the one that we're much more familiar with, and that even the vinyl records that we'll talk about later kind of are modeled on. It's the same kind of logic of how the machine works. In the early 1900s, there's this discovery, you know, there's kind of a race during the age of invention for things that will behave as polymers, or what we would now think of as plastics. Something where you can etch a groove, you can kind of mold it to take a particular shape, and then it will hold that shape. And this very interesting material called shellac, which is sort of a secretion of the lach insect, where most of the production is actually in India. This material is kind of scratched off of these trees, heated down and treated. And, you know, it's still used in things like wood varnishes and nail polishes and things like this. And it's very, very durable. It will hold a groove that's etched into it for a very, very long time and won't fade until you play it very, you know, thousands and thousands of times. The one big sort of scary thing about it, and we'll talk about it more later, is that it's quite brittle. It can break. And also alcohols tend to sort of break it down. There's many different kinds of experiments with things that come up in the following decades. Some of these we've never seen because they don't really catch on. So for example, these aluminium discs from the late 1920s, that don't end up being used very much. In the mid-1930s, a very important one with this discovery of these kind of nitrocellulose acetates, and this is made by taking an aluminium or a glass disc and then kind of plating it with the acetate. And then that can be used. And so, for example, the BBC and definitely the BBC Arabic service, all of their recordings done in-house were done on these discs. So all of the BBC Arabic, what are called transcriptions or sort of in-house recordings, were all made onto these kinds of discs, these lacquer or acetate or nitrocellulose discs. And so in the Arab world, most of these recordings, the first decade or so, first of all, commercial recordings in the Arab world begin in around 1903, 1904. And in this first decade or so are done, like in the rest of the world, on the wax cylinders. And the trailblazers in this, are first, it's also important to mention that it begins in the Arab world kind of the same time that it begins everywhere else. This is around this time when the technology for reproducing a disc comes online. Before this, if a company wanted to produce multiple copies so that they could sell, they would have to physically make each one. So this would involve, for example, putting 10 phonographs in a room, this would be the studio, and trying to angle the horns, acting as a microphone, this is before the invention of the microphone, towards the singers. And so these early records, actually each single one of the cylinders is different from the other, depending on where it was. You'd often hire an artist to perform the same piece over and over and over again so that you could make enough copies so that you could sell it. But by the turn of the century, the technology for reproducing, so creating a master, and then from that, pressing multiple copies, comes online, and that's when the phonograph industry really kind of goes global. The early discs themselves don't fit a great deal of information. So one thing that we have to remember also is all of the old recordings are about 2, maximum 4 minutes long. And it's because of how many grooves you can actually physically fit onto the disc itself. And closer to 1910, when they start to try to record longer pieces, it would only be for the top artists, the ones that they know that they could sell, and they'd sell them in these things that looked like photo albums. And so you'd put multiple discs, and by this time you could record on both sides of the disc. And that's actually where we get the word album, is because it looks like a photo album, these sort of book-like objects that had multiple discs in them become known as albums, a word that is still with us today as, the so-and-so released an album. So the story of the early recording industry is, of course, a story of artists and performers, many of whom we've now forgotten, but who are now actually being remembered. In the last 10, 20 years, I think there's been a resurgence of interest in the early recording artists. People like Mustafa Saeed and the Amar Foundation have really been quite central in this work. The two huge players on the scene were the British Gramophone and Typewriter Company, later called the Gramophone Company. They released a label called His Master's Voice, which then sort of takes on a life of its own. Many people will refer to the company itself as His Master's Voice. Some of you might live in places where there's a shop called HMV, where you go and buy audio and video. HMV is His Master's Voice. But there's also two very important companies in the very early years, we're talking 1906, 1907, that are homegrown. One of these is owned by the Armenian Setrak Meshian, who lived in Cairo and basically set up his own operation, kind of like in his own garage, like in his own house, making these labels and sticking them on. There's so many out there that are actually mislabeled. The other company that's really worth mentioning here is Baydaphone. This is a group of about 6 cousins that live between Beirut and Berlin. There's a lot we can say about them, but just to say that, these are basically indie labels. And what they do is all of these companies, whether it's the British Gramophone Company, the other giant is the German Odeon Company, and then companies like Mashyan and Baydaphone are going around trying to recruit talent, and they're competing over the talent. And this is where you have, the beginnings of things like recording contracts and sort of trying to create fame where your live performances and your recorded performances are also sort of feeding off of one another, creating something kind of new, which is celebrity. And that celebrity itself is something that kind of sells records. You can sell based on your reputation and how recognizable your name is. One thing that I should mention here is that the Mashyan company, one of the reasons a lot of us might see it or hear about it, even if we don't know about this recording industry history, is that it recorded most of the early songs that we have that survive by Sayyid Darwish, by Sheikh Sayyid Darwish. Also, the French company Pathé, the American company Columbia, they all enter the fray, but really it's sort of a game between Gramophone, Odeon, Baydaphone are the three big players. By the 1930s, we get the technology for magnetic recording. It doesn't really get used immediately in commercial audio recording until later. But I did want to just sort of give a little bit about how magnetic recording works, both because it's interesting, but also because it'll inform us why this is also a big conservation issue. With magnetic tape, and I won't get too deep into this, you're basically taking the sound wave and you're moving around magnetized kind of iron compounds to take the form of the sound wave, so that when you play it back, that sound wave goes to your speakers and you can hear it. And this is important because the way that magnetism works is related to the way that these objects also sort of deteriorate, or at least the sound recordings on them, the way that deteriorates. Yeah, we don't need to go into too much. You will have heard maybe of like kind of full track, half track, quarter track, 8-track, etc. This is sort of like how many strips of magnetized kind of iron compounds are on there. In the mid-1940s, you get these sort of magnetic recordings on wires. These were not very much used in the region or even really globally. They don't really take off. The really important one is in the late 1940s, as the development of plastics sort of takes on a much huger part of sort of global industry. It gets used in audio recordings, and this is where we get the vinyl records. And one of the very important things about vinyl records is that you can, with vinyl, with these plastics, you can actually control the etching onto the carrier in a way where you can fit many more grooves onto the same space. And so you begin to be able to fit much more time, basically an entire album. Instead of just 2 minutes, you can fit many, many more minutes, tens and tens of minutes on the same object. One of the great things about vinyl records also is that they're very long lasting. You don't have to worry. I mean, for the same reason that plastics are an environmental disaster, that it takes 200 plus years for it to begin to degrade, is why it's a great preservation medium, because it doesn't degrade. And here's sort of an image of through a microscope, looking at the grooves that are etched in. You can see how much more you can fit in on a microgroove or vinyl disc than you can on the old shellac or lacquer discs. The big revolution is, of course, the early 1960s when Philips comes out with the compact cassette. This now becomes something where you can make your own recordings at home, quite cheap, record from the radio, record from one cassette to another, and start to distribute things. And for me, this one of the things I think about is the performer, one of my favorite ever performers, Sheikh Imam Isa from Egypt, who, because he was considered an outlaw and too much of a radical and a revolutionary, didn't really get studio recordings, was barely recorded or broadcast on radio, but yet became famous throughout the Arab world and beyond, because people would record from one cassette to another. And actually, this is how I first encountered Sheikh Imam on cassettes that were recorded in this way, decades later. Digital formats are often, this is the CD and the DAT and whatnot. These are, I remember when they first kind of became really commercially popular, they look really sort of sci-fi with all of the different colors and lasers and whatnot. They're excellent in terms of you kind of create a one-to-one copy when you make a copy, digital copy from one to another. There's no sort of inherent scratchy noise that we associate with the stylus and some magnetic recordings. It's more immune to interference than analog recordings. But one thing that really kind of we need to keep in mind is that actually they suffer from rapid obsolescence. I'll talk about a bit more what that means in a second, but basically the playback machines themselves. How many of you are using a computer that has a CD drive is one way to think about this, right? And how many people will be using CD drives in 2 years and 3 years and 4? The other thing that's really dangerous with digital formats is that if a digital file is kind of corrupted, at some point, basically there's no way to restore it. Whereas with analog, there's still kind of hope sometimes. So here are the key challenges that we face with preserving this audio heritage. We have thousands upon thousands of audio recordings that were made in the early part of the century that were made on formats that I've just mentioned. And these carriers themselves degrade. Right. So, for example, with a wax cylinder, there's a bit of an irony here. Some of the older formats actually will last much more than most of the newer formats. So a wax cylinder is actually quite a safe medium, but it's fragile, right? It's very sensitive to being broken. If you rub it with your hand, because it's wax-like, can actually kind of erase what's on there or erode it. But also a sudden shift in temperature will make it crack. And there are some horror stories from some archives where attention to temperature wasn't given, where people were more worried about things like light because they were thinking about, what hurts paper, not necessarily what hurts an audio recording. For magnetic tape, which is a much newer format, some of these things will begin degrading in 10 to 30 years. And many of the people listening to this, if you kind of were around for the cassette tape era, you remember what happens when you leave it out in the sun, or you come to play a disc and it snaps, or that the sound is all wonky. It's very similar to also the fate of many videotapes that are out there. With the lacquer discs, actually I have photos of this, the acetates that I talked about, you have the thing that they use to plasticize the nitrocellulose begins to sort of extrude, and it kind of produces an acid that then destroys the disc at about, again, around 30, 40 years. Also, remember I said that it's plated onto an aluminum or glass disc. With changes in temperature, the outer layer, the acetate layer, will contract faster than the aluminum or the glass, and so it will start to peel off or delaminate. There's a certain period in the 30s and 40s where they began to use gelatine instead of nitrocellulose, and gelatine is highly reactive to water. Actually, one of the ways that you test to find out if something is recorded on gelatine is you put a little bit of water on the part of the disc where there's no recording, and immediately it begins to bubble up. That's how you know it's gelatine. But in humidity and things like this, some of you can see kind of the effects in the photo here of just how, there's no way of restoring a disc where this has happened. Again, you're probably, many of you are familiar with your own cassette tapes and videotapes and how they deteriorate and how quickly they can deteriorate. Some of you may have seen the Al Jazeera Plus or Al Jazeera documentary on the film archive in Sudan and just like how it sort of disintegrates at a particular point, if not stored properly. I should say, just as a tangent here, storage and conservation practices are very important, but also what we're talking about is just the nature of the chemicals and compounds that are used. What we do with preservation and the ideal preservation environment prolongs the life of an object like this, but at some point it's just going to degrade because of oxygen, because that's just the nature of the material. The second and more surprising challenge that we face is this issue of obsolescence that I said I'd come back to. Obsolescence here refers not to the carriers and the recordings themselves, but to the machines that we use to record and play them back. And again, I gave that example of how many of you have a CD drive handy, but with things like, and this really affects magnetic tape almost kind of more than most other things, particularly because everything recorded in mid-century, everything that was used in the radio stations, etc., was on these huge open reels of magnetic tape. These machines that were used to record and to play back from magnetic tape have not been manufactured for decades. It would be exorbitantly expensive to manufacture just a small run of them. It's not profitable for any company to go back and sort of do that, and so they're going extinct. And there's a finite supply in the world, and in many cases they're just sitting. People haven't been using them for a very long time. Even the expertise required to keep them, like for the siyana, for the upkeep, has sort of died off as old engineers have passed away or retired or moved on to other things. And then you have the kind of political and institutional issues that can that kind of get in the way. Do we have access to particular archives? Are particular libraries really paying attention to their audiovisual collections? In many of the places that I visited, people weren't even necessarily thinking about their audiovisual collections as part of their kind of institution's collections. For example, if the recording of this event that we're at right now, certain institutions will have filmed events and lectures and things like this, but then they don't necessarily think of them as collection items per se. And so, they sit in a box. If somebody retires, who knows what's in that box or in that cupboard, then, somebody comes and does a cleanup and throws it all away. And this has been the fate of many of our recordings. So now to talk about kind of how this is being addressed, and this is I'll just take a couple more minutes here. The project that my work is sort of modeled on is a project that's happening across the United Kingdom. It was spearheaded by the engineers at the British Library, and it was called Unlocking Our Sound Heritage. And so they spent years just doing what we call scoping, looking around for what are the recordings that are out there. They were focused on non-commercial recordings. They basically created these huge databases of what were on these recordings at different libraries, museums, and archives across the country, sorted them by format, tried to figure out what was on them to prioritize what was going to be recorded. And then you have basically an army of engineers working around the clock, digitizing this material, and then another army of catalogers going in, figuring out what's on there and giving them enhanced cataloging entries so that they can be found. And then so this is sort of some of my work scoping what was in the British Library collection for Middle Eastern recordings. I've talked about cataloging. This is there were over 2,000 items in the audio collection of the British Library that were just titles in Arabic. We didn't even know what was on them. And for most of them, we don't even know who the artist was. And then one of the bigger thorny issues that we face is this issue of rights clearance, right? As finding out who still has rights in an object. And in many of these cases, so something that's recorded on an acetate, on a lacquer disc, for example, I said that's going to degrade after 40 years, but it might be 140 years before all of the rights in the object are cleared for an institution like the British Library to be able to put it up online and make it available. And so this creates its own set of very large problems. Just a final note, I'm talking about unlocking our sound heritage and this project at the British Library. There are at least two really important similar projects that are taking place within their own institutions that I know of. One is Mustafa Said's institution, the Amar Foundation for Arab Music Archiving and Research, which is in Lebanon. which started off with a very important Egyptian private collection that was moved to Lebanon, and then has expanded since, and are doing state-of-the-art digitization and cataloging and curation. The other is actually kind of the Library of Legal Deposit for audio recordings in Tunis, which is called the Arab and Mediterranean Music Center, which is inside the palace of a very interesting character called Baron Rudolf d'Erlanger in Tunis, and they are also kind of trying to the extent that they can, digitize and make available the recordings that they digitize. And so on that note, I'll stop talking, and I look forward to the discussion and your questions.
يعطيك العافية, Hazem. Thank you so much for that fascinating presentation. As you said, we have a couple of guests today, but I think the question I was going to pose to you has also been posed by Barbara Leaf, who was the former US ambassador to the UAE. And she says, this is fascinating stuff. Which regional institutions are doing any important work in this field, and where are there unarchived stories that you hope to get your hands on?
Yeah, so I mentioned Amar, and I mentioned Qasr al-Nijma or Nijma al-Zahra. So for example, I visited Sultan Qaboos University, and the librarians there are incredible. They're trying to digitize everything on shoestring. I mean, not a shoestring budget, but it's not necessarily, digitization isn't a priority necessarily of the library. However, the librarians there are doing what they can with what they have to carry it out. Even more interesting kind of experience I had was at the Kuwaiti National Library of Kuwait, where an elderly gentleman who's sort of in charge of their audiovisual section has bought a machine that will move something that will help you transfer from VHS to DVD. And so he's been creating these digital copies of their very important kind of analog video collection. So, I'm in the process of trying to find out what different institutions and libraries are doing. The thing is that we have an incredible wealth, even in people's private collections, in institutional collections. Think of what's in schools. I'm trained as a historian, so for me, like, I see value in things like a videotaped graduation ceremony from 1968, and I'm not the only one. It's not just valuable to the historian. All of us can find value in a lot of these things. And so, people who are here right now, they themselves, their parents, their grandparents, more than likely have a drawer of cassettes that nobody's listened to for a very long time, that might have something that we don't actually have another copy of. We don't know, right? And so I think a preliminary step is very much to just kind of find out. And another part of the preliminary stuff is just to raise awareness about, good conservation practices, raise awareness that these are important. That box of cassettes or records or videotapes that you got from your parents is something that you need to take care of. And libraries and archives should be ready to accept these from the public, and vet them and figure out what to do with them, or at least to help people figure out how to best conserve them.
Thank you, Hazem. Before I bring in the next question, I think I'll just introduce, we have a special guest today, as you mentioned him, Mustafa Saeed, who is an Egyptian singer, musicologist, composer, and truly the word virtuoso, oud player, applies to him. Mustafa Saeed has composed for several documentaries and plays. He is the winner of the first Aga Khan Music Awards Performance Prize. He lives here in the UAE in Abu Dhabi. I think you mentioned also that he is also the founder of Asil Oriental Ensemble, as well as a number of other musical ensemble. But I thought, let me play briefly a segment of his performance at, how do I share my screen? There you go. Okay. His performance at the very first Aga Khan Music Awards ceremony. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, this is from a 900-year-old poem by Ibn al-Arabi. For those who don't understand Arabic, the lyrics go, I wish I knew they knew what heart they held, that my heart knew what path they tread. You wonder, are they safe or perished? The enamored are in love adrift, ensnared. So this is what he's singing, and I hope you enjoy this.
ليت شعري هل دروا أي قلب ملك وفؤادي لو دار أي شعب سلكوا ليت شعري هل دروا أي قلب ملك وفؤادي لو درى أي شعب سلكوا أتراهم سلموا أم تراهم هلكوا أتراهم سلموا أم تراهم هلكوا حار أرباب الهوى في الهوى وارتبكوا حار أرباب الهوى في الهوى وارتبكوا حار أرباب الهوى في الهوى
Yes. Let me play. Okay, so yeah, that was a wonderful performance by Mustafa Saeed. Mustafa, I am unmuting you, and I think I'd like to ask you about if you like to comment on anything that you've heard today. Let me just before you speak, let me just try and unmute.
How did you come up with it?
Okay, unmuting Mustafa. Sorry, I unmuted all by mistake, so we got to unmute Mustafa alone. There you go. Mustafa, can you hear me? Okay, I'm having trouble unmuting Mustafa. But maybe Hazem, can you talk a little bit about that performance and the importance of what Mustafa is doing?
I unmuted myself. I don't know if you hear me or not.
Thank you. Yes, I can hear you now. Go ahead.
Great. First of all, thank you for this great. I'm sure that I don't deserve all these great things that you told about me. Yeah. Well, regarding the history of the recording in the Arab world, well, it's a very long issue, but well, the wax cylinders, even the mass production of it existed before 1903. It existed in 1895, and then the first catalog that was produced was the Gramophone Company Limited catalog of November 1903. That was not a wax; it was a shellac, already one-sided record. Mishian started in 1912, up 6 years after Baydaphone. He started, in fact, this is very comic. He started like reproducing the older wax cylinders of Abdul Hamouli. Abdul Hamouli died in 1901, before the shellac started in 1903. So Al-Khawaja Setrak Mishian started reproducing these wax cylinders on shellac double-sided discs in Alexandria in 1912. And then when the First World War started and all the companies left Cairo, he started to record his own label, like his own singers that would be Sayyid Darwish, because he was the Alexandrian guy. I mean, he was in Alexandria. So, but it is a very long issue. Well, to talk, I would go and directly to the second issue of the session here, of what's going on. That's why do we preserve the audio records from A to Z? Why do we do this? Are we going to preserve this music? And well, this is why for me it's more of an ideological issue than just a project. Yeah, I mean, regarding the audio archivists, well, there are lots of audio archivists and they are all doing great things. But for me, it's more than in music itself. Yeah, why do we preserve this music? Are we preserving it to make a museum? Well, this didn't encourage me that much. In fact, what encouraged me is that we had to reproduce, or we have to preserve this music for people to listen, one, and for people to know that they have what they can build and start new creation of music that we are totally separated from since since almost 1 century now. We don't know what our classical music is, even the musicians themselves. Since one century back, the word development is a synonym to the word importing. Yes. So if somebody wants to develop the classical or the Arabic practice or the modal practice, the modal system music practice, that means he imports. When the fashion is classical European opera, let's have it. When the fashion is jazz, let's have it. When the fashion is rock and roll, let's have it. There is no real, well, there is development, yes, everybody is free to do, but the internal development was almost died like since many decades. So if we are preserving this music just in order to have a museum, fine, okay, but this doesn't encourage me. If we are preserving this music, this tradition, in order to create new music in this century that's totally contemporary and that leans on this large heritage, then this what made me take the degree in audio archiving, and this what made me, for example, like with my hands, there was a disc that was, it's a shellac that was broken into, I can't remember whether it was 63 or 64 bars, and I collected it and I got the music out of it, yes? So for me, as I told you, it's not a matter only of preserving, it's more of an ideological issue. Why? And 1,000 times, why do we do this? This is why, like, when I started the Amar Foundation with Mr. Kamal Qassar, when he told me that we have this collection, I told him, okay, fine, we can just have much more, as much as you want of collection, but what will we do? He told me, what do you want to do? I told him, I want people to listen to this. I want it to be available to people. And that was the aim of the Amar Foundation project. I don't know, my speech engine tells me that somebody is asking about the 63 broken discs. Yes, it is. It's an prova disc. It's an unpublished disc of Muhammad Qubanji, and I have it. I can send it to Hazem or to Mr. Sultan, and he can publish it for you. Anyway,
Mustafa, thank you so much. It really is a great pleasure and an honor to have you here.
Sorry for talking too much.
No, not at all. It's such a pleasure to have you, and congratulations on winning the Aga Khan Music Award. Hazem, I give you a minute to respond to whatever Mustafa says before we move on to another point. Are you muted? Oh, you are muted? Then okay. Hazem, أنت مش muted. You are? It says you're unmuted. طيب, how about unmute yourself and mute yourself again? There. My audio is really acting up today. So in the meantime, maybe I'll try to bring in another guest. Faraj Abiyad, can you hear me?
Yes. Can you hear
Great.
me?
Yes. Wonderful. So Faraj, we've met in New York about a couple of years ago, I think, and you've performed for us at the opening of our exhibition at the Grey Art Gallery in January. You are a Native American, American-born of Middle Eastern origin. Your ancestors hailed from Syria. You did not speak Arabic. You taught yourself Arabic, and now you speak it so eloquently. But the reason why I wanted to speak to you is that you sing in classical Arabic. And I wanted to ask you about the difficulty or the ease with the challenges that you faced with finding this music and with reviving the Arabic music, as Mustafa Saeed was talking about. Why are we preserving music? To put it in a museum or to infuse it with contemporary music, which is, I think, what you're doing. So you've got a couple of minutes. Go ahead.
Yes. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me today. And I'm humbled to be speaking in front of Hazem. Your work is so beautiful. I very much enjoyed your presentation, and it's specifically humbling to speak in front of Mustafa Saeed, who was a great influence to me and the fellow musicians that I work with in my current project, which, like Sultan said, is basically to revive classical Arabic music, but based on the old traditions and these old recordings that Hazem and Mustafa are preserving. And without this work of preservation, we can never be where we are today in our project here in New York. And basically, you know, we do these concerts on a bi-monthly basis where we sing old Arabic songs and show how they evolve to a newer audience. And our goals are to, like Mustafa was saying, that preserving is amazing, but if we're preserving just to have a library, that's very nice, but the ultimate goal is to spread this music and to let this history and the development of it in our current time be something accessible and enjoyable to the contemporary audience. For example, in Lama Badayta Sanna, which is a very famous muwashah, we attempted to preserve this muwashah on stage. And when we did this, we had to comb through many old recordings, starting with the early 1900s, with the known Sheikh Sayyid al-Safti, which is a very difficult recording to listen to, and through the Amar Foundation and many preservation foundations like it, we listened to many versions. And then on stage, we were combining versions of Lama Badayta Sanna from the early 1900s all the way until the 80s. And then in my own music, when I compose, I attempt to use these old ancient melodies and the most recent recordings we have of them, which is the early 1900s, and to infuse this into the new compositions which I write. I come from actually the Jewish Syrian community, which is based here in New York in Brooklyn. And there's a big initiative in our community to preserve adwar and mushahat. And actually Layla Murad's father was a singer of the community. He used to sing these religious songs. And one of the songs that was produced during his time was Al-Albi Fi Widdak Mushtaq, which is a beautiful dur, which we received from the Amar Foundation. And we learned a lot about it through there. And then we preserved this song, and now it's accessible on iTunes and on YouTube and across all different forms of listening. And so basically, just to wrap things up, the struggle in Arabic, classical Arabic music today is that we don't have enough versions of these old recordings accessible to the masses. And the more we can get these to be accessible to just anyone who wants to listen to nice music from the past, the more we can have success as composers and contemporary musicians to make this old music appealing in a new way. So again, I just want to thank everyone for having me today. And thank you, Sultan, for including me in this discussion. And if anyone has any questions for me, feel free to ask or contact me afterwards.
Thank you. Hazem, I think if you can respond to what Mustafa was saying, and I think what Faraj also said is the importance of what you're doing is reclaiming or safeguarding this musical heritage of the Arab world or the Middle East. One of the reasons is infusing the contemporary culture with this classical heritage that we have. Do you agree with this?
I do, but I want to add to it. So a few things. I think each of us approaches artistic production and cultural production in different ways at different times in our life. I think for a composer or a musician, you want to hear how certain things sounded, so that you can understand, what kind of musical change happened. You want to seek inspiration from it, and you want to maybe kind of preserve certain things, or you don't want them to get lost. The thing, though, is that from an archival institution type perspective, you also want to make things available and to preserve them, audio, for example, or music, not just for musicians and composers. The historian might have something that the social historian might have something also different from a gender historian, different from even an environmental historian. We talked about shellac and insects. Some people might want to listen for the lyrics and know how love was being talked about, want to hear, working in an archive, you want to approach sometimes the materials themselves are something that a historian of technology or science might find inspiration from. And so I just wanted to kind of say that, yes, of course, the interest isn't just to kind of put something and hide it in a basement of a museum somewhere where no one's going to see it, or only those 3 researchers who might have access and find out that this thing is there are going to go find it. But also kind of for institutions like libraries and archives, we want to preserve things for the imaginary future people whose interests maybe we aren't even on the horizon of aren't even on the horizon of our imagination, what they might find interesting in it, right? So I think about newspaper articles, right? So old newspapers are very important for the articles, but then actually the ads are extremely important. The fonts that they used are things that designers now are really interested in, right? And so it's not just one thing that makes these things valuable, and it's not just their age, et cetera, right? And so the work is very important in the ways that Faraj and Mustafa said, and maybe primarily so. But we also need to think about all of the other types of value and possible uses, and that users and researchers and the public and creatives and etc. Will be interested in. I know for me, for example, I've found that the labels and the sleeves, the labels that were stuck onto the recordings and the sleeves that they come in, have been incredibly valuable. And archives, including the British Library, but not only the British Library, for decades threw these things away, the sleeves. It was like, well, this crumbles, it gets dust into the grooves, it's going to ruin our ability to play them back and preserve them, throw them away. They have immense information. And when you think, for example, that a company like Meshian didn't keep an archive, or that the Baydaphone archive was destroyed in 1987 during the Lebanese Civil War, or that the Odeon archive is also inaccessible and destroyed in 1944 bombing of Berlin, a sleeve all of a sudden tells us things that we have no other way of knowing, like the address, like the phone number they had, like what street it was on, like where it was in the city. All these kinds of things tell us things, and they can be important things. And we need to be able to kind of keep things there in case someone in the future has a question that this thing can answer.
Hazem, I have 2 questions for you. The first one is compare the Arab world with the regional states, let's say India, Pakistan, Iran, maybe Turkey, maybe African states which have similar climate, similar recording history. Which one of these states in the region have had major strides in preserving their audio heritage? I assume India, maybe. I'm not sure if other countries. And the second question is, what can we do, the laymen and women, what can we do to support you?
I'm actually not very well positioned to answer your first question. I think Mustafa might know more. I know that even within the Arab world, there's different levels of who's doing more and less. And in many cases, I mean, the example from Tunis is a state archive. The example from Lebanon, Amar, is a private collection that was moved over and is privately run. And maybe that's for the best in some ways. And so, so even within the Arab world, there's different, almost collection by collection, institution by institution, you can think of who's doing more and who's doing less. And again, I want to sort of stress this. It's in the world of libraries and archives, for example, in the Middle East, manuscripts are the kind of top of the pyramid, and everybody's interested in digitizing manuscripts. Not that they shouldn't be digitized and preserved and conserved, but that audiovisual isn't on the horizon for a lot of these bigger institutions. I know that, so I don't know about archives, etc. in Turkey, but I know that I've seen a lot of publication of wonderful old recordings from Turkey. That there has been an effort, whether private or in partnership with the public sector, to put together, you know, liner notes that will tell you about the artist, research into when things, you know. So I said about the catalog information that we have, and Mustafa can back me up on this. We don't know when many of these things were produced. So Mustafa and I have been in a conversation about creating a discography, figuring out what was recorded, when it was recorded, using the catalogs, figuring out even like what settings things are recorded in to figure out when they were made, even if it's just a ballpark figure. For rights clearance, by the way, this is a nightmare because you have no idea when something was published. But even down to the level of just figuring out basic, like who is on this? Who's performing on the oud in the background there? Who is it that was the sound engineer? Who was the artist who drew the image on the sleeve or the... I mean, it's not that this information doesn't exist. It's that there hasn't been the concerted effort to follow it up and kind of put it in a place where people can find it. And again, in the past 5-10 years or so, there has been a renewed interest in this. We're getting more and more things like podcasts, like Dumtak. I see Christina Hasboun here from Dandana Radio, SOAS Radio. We have, you know, so even just kind of Ma'azif, the website Ma'azif has been producing wonderful stuff on even like current avant-garde stuff, but even kind of the older stuff. So there is, and you know, performers like Faraj and the crowd down in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, who are also, you know, the musicians' interest of reclaiming this heritage, playing with it, figuring it out. You know, I mentioned Sheikh Imam. There's at least, you know, 8 to 10 Sheikh Imam tribute bands that are out there that are trying to sort of bring back this heritage. So, you know, I don't know if I've answered your question. I've answered other set of questions. There's a lot of work to be done. The way that you can help with it is, I mean, on a basic thing is sort of, you know, if you know of audio collections, see if you can connect people to local libraries, see if your local libraries, universities, archives are doing the museums are doing this work. Connect people. You know, I see Al-Anud Al-Thani here. Qatar Museums has been doing a wonderful job. She's been doing a wonderful job of figuring out what's in the collections part of the Qatar Museums holdings, and sort of figuring out what's there, cataloging it, getting it all sort of figured out. So this work is being done. Please connect to me. Like if you find a collection, if you want someone to talk to your local museum, if any of these things, I'm happy. Mustafa as well, I'm sure would be happy to sort of connect with people. We're doing this work. We're reaching out. You know, expect things from us in the next 5 to 10 years. But educate yourself. Like if you and your family have things, and this extends to things like photographs and whatnot. But for audiovisual objects. The internet, you know, the IASA, the International Association of Sound and Audiovisual Archives, has great information on what are good preservation practices, you know, temperature, humidity, if you should put it, you know, how it should sit on the shelf. This kind of basic information can, you know, take the shelf life of an object and add 10, 20 years to it. Make a digital copy if you can. This can be like taking it to a local shop. It might not be up to IASA standards, but it's better than nothing. And if you do have a local library or archive that is doing audiovisual work, you know, you can kind of connect people. If you have materials and those people are preserving and conserving, then maybe connect those people to one another.
Hazem Jamjoum, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I think my last request to you will be, if you can send me maybe 2 or 3 links that I can share with people online so that they can follow up maybe a couple of radio stations that you like, a couple of websites that you like that either play interesting music or that can teach them how to preserve. Whatever you can, send my way. So I want to thank you so much. 2 quick announcements. I will be playing a song by Faraj Abiyad as sort of the outro in a few seconds. And maybe just since this is the last Ramadan Majlis, Eid Mubarak to all of you. I hope you had a nice Ramadan. And from next week, we will be going back to 8 p.m. UAE time, so an hour earlier than today. We are still going to stick to the Wednesdays and Saturdays scheduled. Some of the speakers I have coming up are Hana Malallah, the famous Iraqi contemporary artist, is speaking next Wednesday about her own work and her friendship and tutelage under Shakir Hassan al-Saeed. We also have Muhammad al-Shahid, who will talk about architecture in Egypt coming up. Saadi al-Ka'bi and May Muzaffar, who will talk about Iraq. And Ufamia Rizq also is coming up, talking about Jordanian art scene in the 1960s and 70s. So please tune in with us. Thank you, Hazem. It's such a pleasure to have you. I apologize for some of the technical difficulties we've had. I've actually made Hazem host for tonight so that we can control the audio. And I'll be playing Faraj Abiyad, one of his songs, in a second. Don't hang up yet, Hazem, in case you need to. Okay, let me try to share my screen here. Inshallah, it will allow me to share my screen. Okay, so thank you, everybody. Enjoy this song.
تحسبي أن الكلام حبيبتي لغة تدار بعلم العشاق بيني وبينك أبحر ومنازل وواسل لكن إحساسي يسافر لكن إحساسي يسافر يعبر الآفاق
Faraj Abiyad, everybody. Thank you so much. Have a good night. Bye.
Lovely to meet you all.